Commander Zethkar had seen death in 1,000 forms across the galaxy. His 4 arms bore scars from plasma burns, his chitinous hide marked by blade wounds from species whose names were forgotten by time. As the supreme military advisor to the Galactic Coalition, he had witnessed the rise and fall of warrior races that once seemed invincible. The crystalline Vorth who could shatter mountains with their sonic screams. The gas giant dwelling Nephilim whose biomechanical suits could crush starship hulls. The shadow-walking umbral who struck from dimensions beyond normal space. Yet as he stood before the holographic display in the Coalition's war room, studying the tactical data from the Outer Rim conflicts, Zethkar felt something he had not experienced in his 3 centuries of warfare: genuine unease. The data streams showed engagement after engagement where Coalition forces had been systematically dismantled, not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by something far more disturbing. The enemy wasn't just winning battles. They were doing so with a precision and ruthlessness that defied conventional military doctrine. The latest report flickered before him, transmitted from the mining world of Kepler 442b. 3 full Coalition battalions, including elite Vorth shock troops and Nephilim heavy assault units, had been deployed to retake the planet from human separatists. The mission should have been routine. Humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, their technology decades behind the established powers, their military doctrine primitive by galactic standards. They relied on chemical projectiles instead of energy weapons, used crude metal alloys instead of programmable matter, and their soldiers were unaugmented biological entities. The first transmission from Kepler 442b had been confident. Colonel Thexrin of the Vorth reported that human defensive positions had been identified and that the assault would commence within the solar day. The second transmission, 6 hours later, carried a note of confusion. Human forces were not where they were supposed to be. The third transmission never came. When reconnaissance drones finally penetrated the planet's atmosphere 48 hours after communications ceased, they found something that would haunt Zethkar's dreams. 3 battalions' worth of equipment lay scattered across the mining complex, but there were no bodies. No Vorth crystals, no Nephilim biosuits, no trace of the 3,000 Coalition soldiers who had landed on that world. The human defensive positions were empty as well, showing signs of hasty evacuation. The drones had found a single message carved into the metal wall of the main processing facility, written in standard Coalition script. Tell your commanders that Earth sends its regards. The 75th Rangers were here. Zethkar's primary hands clenched as he reviewed the file on this 75th Rangers. The intelligence was frustratingly sparse. They were described as a special operations unit of the Terran Defense Force, numbering fewer than 200 individuals. Their equipment manifest showed nothing remarkable: kinetic rifles, chemical explosives, basic environmental suits. By any reasonable military assessment, they should have been overwhelmed by the first wave of Vorth shock troops. Yet this was not an isolated incident. Similar reports had been filtering in from across the contested zones. The human separatist movement, which should have collapsed within months of the Coalition's intervention, was not only holding territory, but expanding. Every engagement with these special human units ended the same way: Coalition forces simply vanishing, leaving behind only their equipment and cryptic messages. The war room's main display chimed, indicating an incoming priority transmission. Admiral Quexlon's blue-tinged face materialized, his expression grim. "Commander Zethkar, we have a situation developing in the Proxima system. The 12th Fleet is requesting immediate reinforcement." Zethkar's secondary arms gestured for more information. The 12th Fleet was one of the Coalition's premier deep space formations, capable of sterilizing entire star systems. "What is their operational status?" "Unknown. They reported contact with human forces 12 hours ago. Since then, we've lost contact with 17 ships, including the Dreadnought Infinite Resolve." Admiral Quexlon paused, his gill slits fluttering with stress. The last transmission from Captain Vextai spoke of humans boarding the ship. He mentioned something about Marine raiders before the signal cut. The temperature in the war room seemed to drop several degrees. Zethkar had read the classified files on human boarding tactics, dismissed by most coalition strategists as primitive and ineffective. Humans actually entered enemy vessels physically, without protective energy shields or remote manipulation fields. They fought in the cramped confines of starship corridors using handheld weapons, relying on their biological reflexes and some primitive concept they called close quarters battle. It was tactically absurd. It was strategically impossible. It was apparently devastatingly effective. Captain Sarah Chun pressed herself against the bulkhead of the Coalition dreadnought, her breath forming small clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The ship's life support systems had been optimized for the aquatic Quexlon crew, and the corridors were humid and warm, filled with the smell of brine and ozone. Her Marines had been aboard the Infinite Resolve for 3 hours now, and what had begun as a desperate boarding action was turning into something far more significant. "Contact front," whispered Sergeant Rodriguez through the comm, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the ship's engines. Chun could see his position on her tactical display, 2 decks below in what the Coalition called the neural nexus, but which any human would recognize as the ship's main computer core. The plan had been simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Board the flagship, capture or destroy its command systems, and send a message that would ripple through the entire Coalition fleet. What they had found aboard the vessel defied every briefing they had received about alien military capabilities. The Quexlon crew moved through their ship like ghosts, their translucent bodies shifting between visible and invisible spectrums. Their weapons fired streams of superheated plasma that could cut through marine armor like paper. Their technology was centuries ahead of anything Earth had produced. By every rational calculation, Chin's 43 Marines should have been dead within minutes of breaching the hull. Instead, they were winning. The secret, Chen had realized during the first firefight, wasn't superior firepower or advanced technology. It was something the Coalition species had apparently forgotten in their millennia of technological warfare: the psychological component of combat. When Sergeant Kim's squad had encountered their first group of Quexlon defenders in the ship's central corridor, the aliens had done exactly what their training dictated. They had established overlapping fields of fire, utilized their camouflage capabilities, and coordinated their assault with precise timing. What they had not expected was for the humans to charge directly into their plasma streams, absorbing casualties that should have broken any rational military unit, and close to within meters of their positions. The look of shock on the lead Quexlon's face when Private Martinez tackled him to the deck and began fighting hand-to-hand would remain burned in Chen's memory forever. In that moment, she understood why the Coalition was losing this war despite their overwhelming technological advantages. They had never faced an enemy that was genuinely, irrationally willing to die. "Nova Team has secured the bridge," came Lieutenant Foster's voice through the comm. "You need to see what we found here, Captain." Chun made her way through the ship's winding corridors, stepping over the bodies of Quexlon crew members who had died not from plasma burns or explosive decompression, but from what appeared to be simple shock. The Coalition had built their military doctrine around the assumption that all sentient species were fundamentally rational, that when faced with certain death, they would surrender or retreat. They had never encountered humans. The bridge of the Infinite Resolve was a marvel of alien engineering, a spherical chamber filled with floating control surfaces and holographic displays that showed the tactical situation throughout the Proxima system. But what drew Chen's attention was not the technology, but the data streaming across the screens. Fleet positions, communication protocols, command codes, and, most importantly, intelligence assessments of human military capabilities. Lieutenant Foster, his armor scarred by plasma burns, gestured toward one particular display. "Captain, they have files on every major human military unit. Look at this." The holographic display showed detailed analyses of human special operations forces from across Earth's history. The Coalition had studied the tactics of units like the Navy SEALs, British SAS, Russian Spetsnaz, and Israeli Sayeret Makel. Their analysts had correctly identified the key characteristics that made these units effective: superior training, adaptive tactics, and psychological resilience. What they had failed to understand was how these characteristics translated into actual combat effectiveness. Chin scrolled through the assessments, noting the clinical language used to describe human behavior. Subject species displays abnormal tolerance for casualty rates. Documented instances of continued combat effectiveness despite grievous wounds. Apparent disregard for tactical logic when defending territorial claims. The final entry in the file made her blood run cold. Recommendation: avoid direct engagement with designated human special forces units. Standard coalition military doctrine insufficient for countering human psychological warfare tactics. They're afraid of us, Chin whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The coalition, with their plasma weapons and energy shields and starships that could glass planets, were actually afraid of humans armed with chemical bullets and steel knives. The ship's communication system suddenly crackled to life, broadcasting on all frequencies. Admiral Quexlon's voice, speaking in accented but clear human English, filled the bridge. Attention, human forces. This is Admiral Quexlon of the Coalition 12th Fleet. We are prepared to discuss terms of withdrawal from the Proxima system. Please respond on this frequency. Chin looked around at her Marines, seeing her own amazement reflected in their faces. 43 humans armed with primitive weapons had just forced one of the galaxy's most powerful military formations to request negotiations. She keyed her comm unit to broadcast on the Admiral's frequency, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Admiral Quexlon, this is Captain Sarah Chun of the Terra Marine Raiders. You have 2 hours to begin withdrawal of all Coalition forces from this system. Any vessel remaining after that time will be considered a legitimate target. She paused, thinking of all the Coalition assessments she had just read, all their clinical observations about human irrationality and psychological warfare. Consider this your introduction to how humans negotiate. The emergency session of the Coalition War Council convened in the orbital fortress above Centauri Prime, the de facto capital of galactic civilization. Representatives from 47 member species filled the amphitheater, their various forms of life creating a tapestry of evolution's possibilities. Crystalline beings that communicated through harmonic resonance sat beside methane-breathing entities in environmental suits, while energy-based consciousness inhabited specialized containment fields. Commander Zeth Kar stood at the center of the assembly, his 4 arms spread wide as he addressed the gathering. The holographic displays around him showed the tactical situation across human space, and the picture was one that defied every principle of military science he had learned in his 3 centuries of warfare. Honored delegates, Zeth Kar began, his voice carrying the weight of his accumulated years. We face an unprecedented situation. In the past 6 months, we have lost contact with 47 military formations, including 3 fleet groups and numerous special operations units. In each case, the last known opposition was human forces numbering less than 1% of our deployed strength. Counselor Vexthani of the Nephilim delegation leaned forward, her biomechanical form whirring with internal mechanisms. Commander, you speak of military defeats, but our intelligence suggests these humans possess no technology superior to our own. Their ships are slower, their weapons less powerful, their defensive systems primitive. How do you explain these losses? Zeth Kar activated a new display, showing footage captured by emergency beacons from the destroyer Storm's Edge. The images were fragmentary, transmitted in the final moments before the ship's destruction, but they told a story that chilled every being in the assembly. Human soldiers in crude armor moving through the ship's corridors, their movements seeming impossibly fluid and coordinated. Coalition crew members fleeing in panic, abandoning their posts despite having superior numbers and firepower. The humans call it morale, Zeth Kar explained, his primary hands gesturing toward the display. It is a concept that our military theorists have struggled to quantify. It appears to be the psychological component of military effectiveness, the willingness of soldiers to continue fighting even when logic dictates they should surrender. The representative of the ethereal collective, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline matrix, pulsed with skeptical colors. Commander Zethkar, you speak of psychology as though it were a weapon system. Surely trained military personnel cannot be defeated by mere determination. Zethkar had anticipated this response. He activated another display, this one showing combat footage from the siege of Kepler 442b. The recording had been captured by automated systems and showed human soldiers of the 75th Rangers engaging Vorth shock troops in direct combat. The Vorth, with their crystalline exoskeletons and sonic weapons, should have been able to shatter human bone and tissue with ease. Instead, the footage showed humans continuing to advance even after taking wounds that should have been immediately incapacitating. Observe their behavior, Zethkar instructed. When Trooper Zexmore's sonic pulse shattered the human soldier's protective armor, standard doctrine suggests the engagement should have ended. The human was clearly wounded, his weapon damaged, his position compromised. Yet he continued to advance, eventually closing to hand-to-hand combat range, where the Vorth's advantages were negated. The assembly watched in silence as the human soldier, bleeding from multiple wounds, tackled the significantly larger Vorth trooper and began what could only be described as a savage melee. The Vorth, trained in dozens of combat techniques and equipped with natural weapons that could crack stone, was overwhelmed by the human's apparent disregard for his own survival. This cannot be representative, protested Admiral Quexlon, his gill slits fluttering with agitation. No species could sustain such behavior across large military formations. The psychological stress alone would cause unit cohesion to collapse. Zethkar's response was to display a series of reports from across the conflict zone. Battle after battle showed the same pattern. Human units fighting far beyond the point where any rational military force would have retreated or surrendered. The 75th Rangers holding a position against 10-1 odds for 72 hours. Marine raiders continuing offensive operations despite casualty rates that exceeded 50%. Navy SEALs conducting sabotage missions deep behind coalition lines, apparently unconcerned that they had no hope of extraction. The human military appears to operate on principles that we do not fully understand, Zethkar admitted. Their soldiers undergo extensive conditioning that they call training, but which appears to be more akin to psychological modification. They're taught to value abstract concepts like honor and duty above their own survival. They form emotional bonds with their unit members that drive them to extraordinary acts of heroism and self-sacrifice. Counselor Thexmore of the Ancient Assembly, a being whose species had achieved spaceflight when most others were still developing agriculture, spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. You describe them as though they were programmed automatons, Commander. Yet our intelligence suggests they are as individually diverse as any other species. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon, Zethkar replied. These behaviors are not programmed responses, but learned cultural adaptations. Human military units develop what they call esprit de corps, a collective identity that transcends individual survival instincts. They willingly enter combat situations where death is likely, even certain, because they believe their sacrifice serves a greater purpose. The amphitheater erupted in discussions as delegates attempted to process this information. The concept of willingly accepting death for abstract principles was so alien to most coalition species that they struggled to even conceptualize it. Their civilizations had evolved beyond such primitive concepts, focusing instead on technological solutions to conflict and rational approaches to resource allocation. Finally, the senior delegate from the core worlds called for order. Commander Zethkar, assuming your analysis is correct, what do you recommend as our course of action? Surely we cannot simply abandon our territorial claims because one species has unusual psychological adaptations. Zethkar had hoped someone would ask a different question, one that might lead to a peaceful resolution. But the gathering waited for his military assessment, and he was duty-bound to provide it. Honor delegates, based on our current understanding of human military capabilities and behavior patterns, I must recommend that we classify their special operations units as weapons of mass destruction and treat engagement with them accordingly. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the briefing room of the TDF carrier Defiance, studying the holographic display that showed Coalition fleet movements throughout the Outer Rim. As the commanding officer of Joint Special Operations Command, he had access to intelligence that painted a picture both encouraging and deeply troubling. The Coalition was retreating from system after system, but their withdrawal was too organized, too strategic to be the result of simple military defeat. "Sir," called Major Hassan from her position at the communications console, "we're receiving a transmission on the diplomatic frequency. It's Admiral Quexlon, requesting permission to approach under a flag of truce." Webb had been expecting this. The Coalition's military commanders were not fools, despite their apparent inability to adapt to human tactics. They had recognized that conventional warfare was not achieving their objectives and were seeking alternative approaches. The question was whether they genuinely wanted to negotiate or were simply buying time to develop new strategies. "Grant permission for a single vessel to approach. Standard escort protocols." Webb turned to his staff officers. "I want Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 on standby, full combat loadouts. If this is a trap, I want to be able to respond accordingly." 2 hours later, Webb found himself in an unprecedented situation, sitting across a conference table from the Supreme Naval Commander of an alien empire. Admiral Quexlon had arrived aboard a small diplomatic vessel, accompanied only by a minimal security detail and a translator unit. The Quexlon's translucent blue skin shifted nervously as he spoke, his large black eyes fixed on Webb with unmistakable wariness. "Colonel Webb," the Admiral began, his words filtered through the translation device into accented English. "I must confess that this meeting represents something of a paradigm shift for the Coalition. In our recorded history, we have never found it necessary to request a parley with what our analysts classify as a primitive military force." Webb kept his expression neutral, though he noted the careful phrasing. The Admiral was acknowledging human military effectiveness while maintaining the fiction that the Coalition remained technologically superior. "Admiral, I appreciate your directness. What terms are you prepared to discuss?" The Admiral's gill slits fluttered, a sign Webb had learned indicated stress or uncertainty. "Before we discuss terms, I must ask you to help me understand something that our strategic analysts find incomprehensible. Your forces continue to accept casualty rates that would be considered catastrophic by any reasonable military standard. Our intelligence suggests that human soldiers voluntarily enter situations where survival is statistically impossible. Why?" Webb had expected this question as well. The Coalition's fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology was perhaps their greatest strategic weakness, but explaining it to an alien mindset was like describing color to a being that had never possessed vision. "Admiral, let me ask you a question in return. What is the oldest Coalition member species, and how long has it been since they faced an existential threat?" The Admiral consulted his data pad briefly. The Ethereal Collective achieved spaceflight approximately 12,000 years ago. They have not faced significant military challenge for roughly 8,000 years. Humanity achieved spaceflight less than 100 years ago. We have faced existential threats continuously throughout our recorded history. Every human soldier understands that our species' survival depends on our willingness to pay whatever price is necessary to defend our people. Webb leaned forward slightly. "Your species have evolved beyond the need for such sacrifice. We have not yet had that luxury." The Admiral's response was immediate, but surely rational calculation would suggest that preservation of individual lives serves the greater good of species survival. Dead soldiers cannot defend future threats. Webb smiled grimly. "Admiral, that assumes that survival is our primary objective. But human military doctrine recognizes that some things are more important than mere survival. We call them principles, and we have proven repeatedly that we will die rather than abandon them. For several minutes, the Admiral sat in silence, apparently processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been fear. Colonel Webb, our analysts have concluded that direct military confrontation with human special operations forces results in outcomes that cannot be predicted using standard tactical models. We are prepared to discuss territorial concessions in exchange for cessation of hostilities. This was the moment Webb had been preparing for since the conflict began. The coalition was offering to negotiate from a position of perceived weakness, but the reality was more complex. Humanity was winning individual battles through superior psychology and tactics, but the coalition still possessed overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. A prolonged war would eventually favor them, once they adapted their strategies to account for human behavior patterns. Admiral, I'm authorized to discuss preliminary terms, but you need to understand our position clearly. Humanity did not seek this conflict. You initiated hostilities when you claimed sovereignty over human-settled worlds. We are fighting for our right to exist as an independent species. The Admiral's expression shifted, his translucent features taking on what Webb interpreted as confusion. Colonel, our territorial claims are based on standard galactic law. These systems were incorporated into the coalition mandate through legal processes established over millennia of interstellar governance. Processes that humanity had no part in establishing and did not consent to, Webb replied. From our perspective, you're occupying our territory and demanding we submit to alien rule. Every human military unit understands that we are fighting for our freedom. This concept seemed to genuinely perplex the Admiral. But, Colonel, coalition membership provides numerous benefits: technological advancement, protection from hostile forces, access to galactic trade networks. Why would any species choose independence over such advantages? Webb realized he was witnessing something remarkable: first contact between two fundamentally different approaches to existence. The coalition represented the logical endpoint of technological civilization, where rational calculation and mutual benefit governed all interactions. Humanity represented something far older and more primitive: the willingness to choose death over subjugation. Admiral, let me put it in terms your analysts might understand. We have calculated that the probability of successful resistance is approximately 15%. We have also calculated that the probability of maintaining our cultural identity under coalition rule is approximately 0%. Therefore, we choose resistance. The Admiral's gill slits stopped fluttering, and his expression became very still. You are telling me that your entire species has chosen to face annihilation rather than accept integration into galactic civilization. That's correct, Webb confirmed. And, more importantly, every human soldier understands and accepts this choice. That's why your forces keep encountering humans who fight beyond any rational point. We're not trying to achieve tactical victory in individual engagements. We are demonstrating that conquering humanity will cost more than you are willing to pay. For the first time since the meeting began, Admiral Quexlon looked directly into Webb's eyes, and what Webb saw there was the dawning realization of just how dangerous humanity truly was to the established order of galactic civilization. For the Treaty of Proxima Centauri was signed aboard the neutral station Concordia, witnessed by representatives from 37 species and broadcast across the galaxy. The document itself was unremarkable by galactic standards, a standard territorial agreement that recognized human sovereignty over their settled worlds and established protocols for future interaction between humanity and the coalition. What made it extraordinary was what it represented: the first time in recorded galactic history that a technologically primitive species had forced the coalition to negotiate as equals. Commander Zeth Carr stood in the observation deck of his command ship, watching as human and coalition vessels maintained their positions throughout the system. The ceasefire had held for 72 hours now, but the tension remained palpable. Both sides understood that the peace was fragile, built not on mutual trust, but on mutual respect for each other's capacity for destruction. The door behind him chimed, and Admiral Quexlon entered, his usually confident bearing replaced by something approaching exhaustion. The Admiral had spent the past 3 days in continuous negotiations with human representatives, and the experience had clearly taken its toll. The humans have agreed to the final terms, Quexlon announced, settling into one of the observation chairs designed for aquatic species. They maintain sovereignty over their current holdings, with a buffer zone of 10 light-years around each settled system. In exchange, they agree to limit their military expansion and provide advance notification of any major fleet movements. Zethkar nodded, though his attention remained focused on the human vessels visible through the viewport. Even now, after witnessing their capabilities firsthand, they appeared unremarkable. Simple metal constructions powered by fusion reactors, armed with kinetic weapons that would have been considered obsolete by galactic standards centuries ago. Yet every coalition captain in the system was acutely aware that those primitive ships were crewed by beings who had proven themselves capable of extraordinary feats of warfare. "Admiral," Zethkar said quietly, "in your negotiations with the humans, did you gain any insight into whether their behavior patterns are typical of their species as a whole or limited to their military units?" Quexlon's gill slits fluttered thoughtfully. "That question troubled me as well. I spoke extensively with Colonel Webb about human society and culture. What I learned suggests that their military behavior is not an aberration, but rather a concentrated expression of fundamental human characteristics." He paused, consulting his datapad. "They have a concept called heroism that appears throughout their cultural expressions. Individuals who sacrifice themselves for others are celebrated and remembered. Their entertainment media frequently features stories of individuals who choose certain death rather than abandon their principles." The implications sent a chill through Zethkar's consciousness. If human military behavior was representative of their species' psychological makeup, then humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization, an entire species conditioned to choose death over submission. "There is something else," Quexlon continued. "The humans have made it clear that this treaty represents only a temporary cessation of hostilities. Colonel Webb informed me that they view this agreement as an opportunity to prepare for future conflicts, not an end to their expansion ambitions." Zethkar turned away from the viewport, his forearms spreading in a gesture of confusion. "Admiral, they negotiated this treaty from a position of strategic weakness. Their technology remains inferior, their numbers limited, their territorial holdings insignificant by galactic standards. Why do they speak as though they have achieved victory?" "Because from their perspective, they have," Quexlon replied. "The humans never sought to conquer coalition territory or overthrow galactic government. Their objective was simply to establish their right to exist as an independent species. By forcing us to recognize their sovereignty, they have achieved their strategic goals." The concept was so alien to coalition thinking that Zethkar struggled to process it. Every previous conflict in galactic history had been fought for territorial gain, resource acquisition, or political dominance. The idea of fighting simply for the right to be left alone was completely outside established strategic doctrine. "Commander," Quexlon said, his voice taking on a note of concern, "there is one additional matter we must discuss. The humans have requested permission to establish diplomatic relations with other species independently of coalition oversight. They wish to share their military training methodologies and cultural practices with any species that expresses interest." Zethkar felt his secondary hearts skip a beat. The coalition's dominance of galactic civilization was built on the principle that conflict could be managed through technological superiority and rational negotiation. If human military concepts began to spread to other species, if other beings learned to value abstract principles over individual survival, the entire foundation of galactic order could collapse. Have any species expressed such interest? 17 so far, including the Kethmori warrior clans and the nomadic drift riders. Both cultures have traditions of individual combat that might prove compatible with human military philosophy. Quexlon paused, his expression grave. Commander, we may have avoided one war only to enable the conditions for something far more devastating. Through the viewport, Zethkar could see human ships beginning to form up for departure. Their crews would return to their home worlds carrying stories of how a handful of primitive soldiers had forced the galaxy's greatest military power to negotiate. Those stories would spread, inspiring others to consider that perhaps technological superiority was not the ultimate determining factor in warfare. As he watched the human fleet depart, Zethkar realized that the Treaty of Proxima Centauri marked not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a new era in galactic history. Humanity had introduced concepts that would fundamentally alter how every species approached questions of independence, sovereignty, and resistance to authority. The humans called it freedom, and they had proven willing to die for it. More troubling still, they had proven willing to kill for it, and to do so with an effectiveness that defied every principle of military science the Coalition had developed over millennia of expansion. In the years to come, Zethkar knew Coalition military academies would study human tactics and try to develop countermeasures. But he suspected that missing the point entirely. The true threat humanity posed was not tactical or technological, but philosophical. They had demonstrated that a species could choose to fight rather than submit, could value principles over survival, could find victory in simple defiance. And across the galaxy, other species were beginning to ask themselves why they had never considered such possibilities. The humans had planted seeds that would grow in ways no one could predict, watered by the blood of soldiers who had chosen death over surrender and nurtured by the example of a species that refused to bow to superior force. The age of unquestioned Coalition dominance was ending, and in its place was rising something far more chaotic and unpredictable, the age of choice.